Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about the very first Avengers movie. When kind of looking at it, I think a lot of people, every single time a new Marvel movie comes out, I think a ton of people, have to crazily go and rewatch a lot of these movies and kind of reflect on how great they were at the time, but maybe much more so now. Maybe some of them don't quite hold up, or maybe there's some that kind of feel very clunky or something along those lines. Ultimately, today I'm going to go out of my way to reflect on the very first Avengers movie because ultimately I'm hoping that eventually this is going to bleed into me wanting to just go over and just kind of reflect on a lot of the other Marvel movies that I've yet to review on this channel. There's a lot of reflection that could go on. There's ultimately some series that I haven't quite seen yet. I think every single movie I have had seen at some point, begrudgingly if I like them or not. But ultimately, I think me talking about the very first Avengers movie will ultimately finally get me to really sit down and want to watch the season, if not seasons, of Agent Carter because I've never quite seen that show yet. Ultimately, I've heard good things about that show, but I never went in and cared about watching it because it's like, well, it's a time period piece, and I don't think that a time period piece has any importance of current product MCU. But when looking at it, I can maybe watch this show and get some fondness for certain characters that appear in certain films. But ultimately, when looking at Agent Carter, I just assumed that it's kind of like a time period piece that feels very much like Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So it's just kind of like, you know what, I'm not quite sure about watching that show or not. But I think now I want to finally just go into that show and watch it and just kind of see if it is really as good as everyone said, or ultimately if it's a little rough. So hopefully this pops off me going into every single Marvel Avengers movie, if not every single Marvel film that is added into the MCU, even as something as light as Ghost Rider or Blade or something along those lines. Just every single Marvel movie, just reflecting on them and ultimately talking about them and watching them again and enjoying for how goofy some of them were and how fun some of them were. So let's let's talk about Avengers in a very cryptic like sense. If anything, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of teeing up at some points because ultimately, if people have not seen this movie at some point, it's been out for seemingly a decade at this point, but also it's a movie that, when looking at it, I think now it still holds up, but there's some kind of goofy things about it. And when watching the very first Avengers movies, or the very first Avenger movie, ultimately there's something about it that is kind of eating away at a lot of people that they eventually bring up when watching movies like Winter Soldier or other things along that way. So let's go into talking about the Avengers films. So ultimately, let's kind of talk about every member and talk or every Avengers member at the current second in this movie, where they kind of all are. It seems like most of the Avengers members are kind of at a transitional moment, or reasonably they're either at an origin moment or they're at a reflection moment, or ultimately they are finally getting their moment to give you time and ultimately see where their journey is currently at the second now to actually tell us something about these characters. So going into this, let's very much kind of in a roundabout way. Let's at first talk about Captain America. So Captain America in this movie is again a guy that is out of time, and reasonably in this movie, I think Captain America, especially through this film, is really going through the motions much more so than anything else. And because ultimately he is kind of ripped from all the ones that he loved, and he is ultimately in a more modern time that he doesn't understand, and he is just like uh he is ultimately just crazily punching a heavy bag because he has nothing better to do. He has nothing better to do. He's just kind of very frustrated about how he's lost so many things, and basically he's just punching away the heavy bag because, like, reasonably, he has nothing better to do. And like he's just kind of living that time of him being Captain America and being a dancing monkey and putting on these shows, waiting for his next battle. Um, and that's really what he is um, during this time. Because he has a huge amount of frustration built up, and hence why he's just punching away at a bag because everything had been ripped away from him. So, Hulk. Hulk very much in this movie had like Hulk and Captain America kind of have like very much a same quasi similar like story. Ultimately, Captain America had been gone for so long, and he has ultimately been hidden away to uh, ultimately been hidden away because he doesn't understand his modern world. And to where Hulk has hidden away from a world that hates him and fears him, and that ultimately is in a very X Men like way, very much hiding away to subdue his anger, to ultimately try as much as possible to go and hide from any villain he's ever had by going into a place that no one would bother to look for him in some third world country, to where he can try as much as possible to still help people and ultimately hide out from everybody that is after him. And so, like, Captain America is hiding from a world he doesn't quite understand. Hulk is hiding from a world that is wanting to hurt and kill and destroy him. So like both Captain and Hulk, like I think should honestly have like should have had this moment of like realizing that they're basically one and the same, because when watching the Incredible Hulk, they basically pretty much are one and the same. Going into Thor. Thor very much in this movie is like he's starting to grow up. Like he's starting to mature. He's starting to become wiser. Because ultimately, in the very first Thor film, he had realized how he had wanted to just battle everyone and beat everybody and think that that was the answer for everything. He was the guy that took a hammer to everything, and even when the even when the thing didn't really, like when this guy ultimately needed a screwdriver to just put in a screw, he's like, no, I'm going to use this hammer. It's like, you don't need a hammer for everything there, bud. To where like when he's asked to put the hammer down, let's say, like he doesn't want to do it because ultimately he's so used to Um, he's so used to, like, he's a child. Like, he basically has a favorite toy, and eventually when that toy is taken away from him, he has to learn and grow, and via timeout, like, realize, like, okay, well, like, I figured out some things. Like, Thor to me is still always going to be that child that is, um has not quite grown up to ultimately take the reins of his throne, because he is still a child that's learning. He's still a child that's growing. He's starting to um, learn things. And ultimately, while in this movie, I think Thor's biggest problem is he just wants to get his man. And um, basically when he can't get, or basically when he has gotten his man, basically he has nothing else to do. Like, basically he's just like, his journey is to only go after Loki, and like that is it. Once his journey to get Loki is resolved, basically there has to be like seemingly another Loki-esque like character invented for Thor to go up against, because that is Thor's thing. Like, basically he is basically been fighting Loki for all of his life, that anything other than that he just does not care about, which is sad. Uh he is just this person that is kind of living in this broken record, and he just can't get out of it. Which in comic books would ultimately prove true. So, going into the next character, so we have Iron Man. Iron Man basically in this movie, uh, I think for him, when really his feathers are very much getting ruffled in this movie, because Iron Man goes right off from being an Iron Man 2, where basically his biggest thing is that he ultimately mentions that no one has beaten him on his best day. So ultimately, um, when going into the Avengers, he's just like, well, you know what? I don't really like that Nick Fury seems to be one step ahead of me. You know what? I don't really like that. I don't like this Loki guy, and it seems like he's like better than I am. And like, I don't really like any of like these other superheroes, because you know what? Like, I just don't like that they think that they have some edge over me, and that I'm just a guy in a suit. Like, you know what? I really don't like this because he's just like, because ultimately, whenever he would have somebody that would be above him, he would always take that person and try as viciously as possible to break them down to his level. And he's ultimately like, I think Iron Man in this movie is so obsessed with, I gotta break everyone down to my level. Once he starts to see like uh Captain America, and he starts to see um, like actual like supervillains and superheroes and this and that. He is desperately trying, if not with just words, to break them down to his level. Um, like, ultimately, he Iron Man himself has this belief of a no lose scenario. Every time he's going to come in, he's going to win, because Iron Man 2 basically showcases that. So, reasonably, in this scenario, he's like, well, like, I beat almost dying. So now, like, I'm unstoppable. I'm unbeatable, and I'm going to live forever. And like basically wants seeing like a god is basically in his way. He's just like, no, like I'm gonna be the guy that punch outs a god because like basically like I've been like an unbeaten boxer for so long. Like I'm 50 and 0 kind of thing. So he's just like I'm gonna keep that record. And when somebody's sniffing around and trying to like go after that record, immediately Tony is just like, no, no, you're not gonna touch that streak. You're not gonna be the one. Um, you're not gonna be the like. I don't think that. Uh, like when really breaking and figuring out Loki, like I think uh that Iron Man is basically in his head already assessing that he's like, dude, there's no way this guy's gonna take me down. Like this guy's pageantry, this guy's um like this guy wants to just sit on a throne somewhere and he's good. Like this guy isn't the guy to slaughter everybody. Like this guy just wants to um he just wants to uh sit atop of a throne somewhere, and like that's where Iron Man is just like, dude, this guy is like wasting my time. Like if this guy was a true legitimate threat and he wanted to wipe me off of existence, then once we kind of get into Age of Ultron, like then I can understand where Iron Man is actually seeing this villain as a threat. Loki to Iron Man is nothing because again, Iron Man is seeing Loki as a guy that wants to sit on a throne somewhere and send the T'Chari after people. Um, the Chitari, and I'm like, I'm probably gonna mispronounce that a lot. So get ready for that. Ultimately, I never really quite understood why Loki. Speaking of Loki, I never really understood why Loki had to have his own army of T'Chari. Uh, and because I'm thinking, okay, so Loki has the stick of the glow stick of death, and ultimately, I'm like, why wouldn't Loki just take control of everybody? Why does he have to have his own army in place? Well, I guess if ultimately you're thinking about it, like, how would any normal humans be any threat to superhuman people? Well, I guess that kind of makes sense, but still, when looking at it, I don't think an army like the T'Chari, like, uh, really does that as well, or does that as like it doesn't really seem like they're really all that truly menacing. It's just that they just have like numbers. They just have the numbers. But again, when looking at it, like their numbers aren't all that ooh exciting. So going into this, my biggest gripe is one that Hulk was not a villain in this movie, or Hulk wasn't turned like Hawkeye was. That is my biggest gripe. Uh, so that is a huge thing, a huge problem for me because ultimately, when looking at the very first Avengers story, I was like, well, why wasn't Hulk turned into being a villain? Like that was my biggest gripe because ultimately I'm like, well, like, and then ultimately when they could have re-swayed him later on and this and that. So one thing that I cementingly want to mention is after we talk about uh, after we talk about the last two characters, Black Widow and Hawkeye, and plus even Nick Fury. Um, I'm going to talk about something that like really kind of bugs me. So, Black Widow. Black Widow, we never really got to know much of anything about her in Iron Man 2. Basically, we just to like every single one of these movies we get to learn a little sliver about her, but reasonably she is just another soldier being put out to uh, beat something. And within this movie we find out that she is a very persuasive like person. Every single either man or woman that she goes up against like is basically spilling the beans to her for some bizarre reason that doesn't really quite ever make sense to me. And eventually we also realize that Black Widow is very much a person that had been battle hardened, and ultimately what we get to learn in like other movies is how like really extensively battle hardened she had been. But in this movie we only get to hear that she had just um, had a reputation for murdering a lot of people, and because she was Russian, or she used to be. And so ultimately she had to kill a lot of people that ultimately when looking at it she's like, yeah, I kind of regret having to do uh, a number of any of these murders, but that's what I had to do. So Hawkeye. Hawkeye in this movie, as per the Thor movie, doesn't really seem like he has much to do in this movie, as far as like they couldn't figure out a way to write him into this story. So I think they just turned him into being a villain just because they're like, well, we don't know quite yet how to figure out how to write Hawkeye and make him important into this. So instead, Hawkeye's driving force is that at first he becomes a villain, which after he gets brought back out of that, that is his driving force. Is that eventually he had to forcibly do all these things, and now he is back on track and ready for the fight. Nick Fury in this movie is, or in a lot of movies, is always the person that is always trying to be one step ahead of everything. And ultimately, him being one step ahead of things is great and all, but when looking at it, in this movie, he is starting to see that, yeah, being one step ahead of everything doesn't make any sense, because when reasonably all of a sudden you have gods and monsters and demons and all this stuff coming to your doorstep and you're caught with your pants down, and one step ahead doesn't make a lick of difference um, when you're facing against a foe that is basically unbeatable or undefeatable, and like it's an unstoppable force against an immovable object, because it's just like, well, yeah, I could be one step ahead of this person, but realistically, once somebody is evenly matched and they're stepping ahead of you while you're trying to one step ahead them, and that's where the stalemate happens. And so ultimately, to where um, Nick Fury has to pull the red flag or whatever kind of flag on the play, and bring in a response team, or in other words, the Avengers. So going into this movie, here is my biggest gripe about this film, if I haven't mentioned this, because ultimately I've tried a couple times to try to make this review as short as possible. So I've kind of talked about it, and ultimately I'm thinking that I've said things already. So here's my biggest gripe about this film. We never actually get the Avengers to really legitimately be the Avengers. Hence why we never actually say Avengers Assemble or anything along those lines. We jokingly kind of and then we don't go into it. Um, so in this movie, I feel like we never actually have the Avengers ever be the Avengers. Like the Avengers in this movie, it's like if anything, like half of the movie is getting them together, and or a bulk of the movie is getting them together, getting the driving force for them to be a team, and but really they never actually become a team because when Captain America is throwing down what they're all supposed to do, they all separate again. They all separate again and they all do their individual things, which is kind of hilarious. So it's like it's a team that's not really a team because everybody's just doing their own stuff. And but ultimately Captain America the whole time is running down what they're doing. Again, here's where this movie like I think this story like is kind of odd to have a limited team like they have and do this story this way. Um, I think it would have been smarter to have a limited team for some of the other stuff that happens in some of the other uh, Avengers movies, but um, to have a limited team going on here for this movie doesn't make sense because there's like I think there should be kind of separations of certain teams to take down this whole T'Chari threat. And I'm going to pronounce that wrong repetitiously. T'Chari, T'Chari, T'Chari. I'll give up on trying to pronounce it correctly. So ultimately, here's one thing that now we have to bring up. Um, anyways, um, I think if we haven't got into spoilers already, uh, here's here's my thing. So yeah, we kind of don't quite get into teams at this point, but I think we're probably going to get into spoilers here pretty soon if we haven't already. Again, so kind of giving people a lead up of where all the people are, all the characters are, and this and that. So now I think let's get into spoiler terms about where this movie goes, and still some of my gripes that I think a lot of people at certain points have noticed and mentioned certain things at certain points to kind of poke fun at these movies for not realizing that they should have done a couple things here and there. So, one thing cosmetically in this movie, if you kind of look at a lot of the characters, I'm like, yeah, a lot of these characters look very Barbie doll esh and look very like action figure or Barbie doll esh, like as if every single one of these characters were made to look like they're merchandising um, products, like their action figures, their dolls, their whatever their things were. To look at all the makeup and to look at all the bizarre ways of which every single one of these characters look, it looks very weird when looking at all these characters. Because I'm like, you know what? Every single one of these characters, like, it looks like they're putting on too much makeup or they look very odd. And when ultimately uh, looking at this approach of like having like the Hulk. Like the Hulk has a very Doctor Heckle and Mister Hyde thing going on, but then again, you're kind of not understanding exactly the dynamic because reasonably, Hulk and Banner are two separate entities, but then again, Hulk and Banner are technically one and the same. at some point in this movie, because it actually showcases. At first, it makes you feel like they're two different things, but then towards the end of the movie, it makes you realize that, oh no, they're one and the same. And yeah, it's kind of very convoluted and kind of odd of ways to kind of. I guess it kind of is like the Venom thing, like we are Venom kind of thing. How like Venom always says we, even though it's an individual thing. It's a parasite onto a person, so it's kind of like that whole like we are Venom thing. I guess is really what Hulk is. Hulk or Banner and Hulk basically would call themselves individuals, but when looking at it, they're a whole because ultimately it's like a parasite onto a host, and both of them need to both live together to exist. But again, it's like it kind of comes off as two separate entities, but when looking at it, them sharing one bot, it's freaking confusing in this movie to ultimately just be like, okay, like why is it feels like two separate halves of a whole, but then when looking at it, like when we get to one point of this movie, it's like, oh no, they're one and the same. So confusing. So going into this, let's get into spoilers. So let's break it down. Ultimately, breaking down this movie. Break it down. Break it down. So, anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about the time we're going to spoil this movie because I ultimately took 30 minutes to analyze and break down this film before even getting to the actual portions of actually talking about this movie. So, in the very beginning of this movie, we have ultimately Loki talking to this character called the Other. Ultimately, I'm assuming that they didn't want to call the other character Death because that would have actually made sense. Because ultimately, that has kind of bugged me forever why they would call the other. I'm like, isn't that guy Death? Like, because Thanos usually has a best friend, and that best friend is Death. And how they would call this character the other effing confuses me. So ultimately, Thanos had brought Loki back to life through, I guess, I'm assuming using the character the Other. And so ultimately, we get it to where Loki is now pushed to, I think, desperately wanting to not only fight his brother, but to conquer the Earth because ultimately that is Thanos' goal. And ultimately, Loki has revenge not only on his brother, but on the Earth because ultimately his brother loves the Earth so much for the time that he had spent on it to where he was going to give up his life for it. So ultimately, Loki, if he can't take Asgard, then he's ultimately going to take the Earth from his brother. Because again, bitter rivalry, and again, neither Loki nor Thor has ever grown up. So ultimately, we have that sweet, delicious, very much nutritious Salvik. He is checking on that Tesseract. He's doing a little beep boop on the Tesseract, doing a little science stuff. He's just like, yeah, that Tesseract. It's a very powerful source. Ultimately, when we try to shut it off, it turns itself back on because it's its own power. To the point where ultimately Nick Fury is just like, "Hey, Hawkeye, why don't you check it on the Salvik guy? Seems like an important thing to do." And Hawkeye's like, "Well, I check things from a distance, and ultimately it seems like there's no guy that's ultimately going to be the booger man trying to come after Selvig, so I think we're all good." But then ultimately, we have the Tesseract malfunctioning, and the Tesseract all of a sudden opens a doorway for Loki to pop on in with his Staff of Doom, his glow stick of destiny, and he is starting to manipulate people because they have a heart. And he is taking his staff and putting and poking people with his staff to ultimately change them into being his minions. Which ultimately, I'm like, that's my gripe. Why is it that Loki has the T'Chari when ultimately he can manipulate mass people? Like, you would think that he would just ultimately have gotten and manipulated the Hulk and Hulk villain, technically in this movie. But I guess it is what it is. So, while Loki is dancing around doing his thing, telling that he brings glad tidings and that ultimately that uh, he is ultimately freeing people from freedom and this and that, and like everybody should be like so happy that he had come, and so Fury is scrambling trying to get the briefcase to ultimately toss in the Tesseract and just bounce. He's like, deuces, I'm outie. But ultimately, he just wants to talk to Loki some more to kind of figure out where his head's at. To ultimately figuring where Loki is trying to kind of wither his way. Because there's a thing about this movie, like we have a very much Shakespearean thing, or there's a lot of funny things going on. It's either a very Shakespearean-ish like talk, or it's funny talk. So ultimately, like Loki is noticing that Fury is trying to get the cube, the Tesseract, and he's like don't take that, I need that. And ultimately, he's telling them that I come with glad tidings, and that ultimately, like he's basically here to conquer the Earth, and ultimately, Nick Fury's like, well, like it sounds like you're here to like quarrel with us, and because ultimately he's just there to kind of take over a weaker species, and kind of Loki hits him with it's like, well, an ant has no quarrel with a boot, but you know it happens anyways. So reasonably just gets to the point where Clinton interrupts this whole like Shakespearean-ish like talk, because like, hey, Sealand's gonna be about to break down on us, because all the while Coulson is scrambling to try to evacuate this entire environment because stuff is popping off. And so ultimately Clint's noticing, hey, we're gonna have a cave in here, like this roof is coming off, and so ultimately we need to leave. So Clint shoots Fury and then just takes the Tesseract. You know what? In Iron Man 2, Nick Fury just goes for like 12 hours long about Iron Man and Rhodey, where Rhodey took Iron Man's suit. He ultimately keeps saying that's like, you're Iron Man, and he just took it? Like, dude, like one shot to the chest, and the Tesseract is just out of your hands, Fury. What kind of crap is that? What kind of garbage kind of thing are you running here, where freaking Clint just shoots you somewhere, and he can just take the Tesseract from you, and Loki is just like, well, hey, thanks for the thanks for the little chat, but I'm gonna leave now. So ultimately, Maria Hill is noticing that Fury, or that Clint is leaving with a brand new with not only a brand new car, but also a brand new Asgardian named Loki. So ultimately she's like, well, hey, like, who's the new guy? And Clinton's like, I don't know, he never told me. So ultimately, Nick Fury is popping on the walkie. He's like, hey, you know what? Clint's turned. He's a villain now. You gotta shoot him down, Maria. So she tries to shoot him down, but you know what? That just doesn't quite work out. So eventually, Nick Fury is like, well, plan B. I gotta get my response team. So that's when the big, huge Q of Avengers logo comes up on the screen. And now we have to start putting people together. So again, Captain America is boxing away, just popping away at his heavy bag. Nick Fury is telling him, "Hey, you gotta uh hey, you gotta come back with me. If anything, let me show you an image of the Tesseract, which you've already seen, and let you know, hey, like we gotta scramble. Loki has the Tesseract." And so ultimately, uh Captain America's like, "Oh, you want me to be placed back in the world?" And Nick Fury is like, "No, I want you to come back to save it." So ultimately, Captain America or Steve is ultimately realizing like, dude, you should have like never like tried to like wield this power, because it's like, if anything, you should have just kept it in the water, because ultimately no one would have ever known about this thing. We have Iron Man that is trying as much as possible for him to come up with his like energy. Like it's all an energy race. Like it's all just like um, a light for all mankind to share. And now Iron Man is coming up with self-sustaining energy and this and that. And so ultimately, like Captain America is like, God, like, you know what? If we would have just not poked around at things, and but that's a problem with you modern time kids. Like, you just gotta keep poking at things. You're like, you just gotta keep escalating things, and you gotta find this like this everlasting gobstopper kind of thing, and like you just gotta keep going at that. And the problem with that is just like, yeah, you want this like thing that is gonna last you forever, but what happens um when somebody takes that everlasting gobstopper and uses it against you in kind of a metaphorical kind of talk? So we we go now, and we have to like start grudging up all of these characters. And so Captain America is kind of second guessing everything, to where he's just like, well, hey, like, yeah, I guess I'm going to be back with this team now. I guess I'm going to be with this Avengers, whatever that means. And so reasonably, we have Coulson that is like swooning over him, and he's like, oh yeah, like, it's great to have you here, Captain America. It's like, I have a bunch of I have a bunch of baseball cards for you to sign or whatever, and they're mint in box. And so ultimately, Captain America is just like, well, hey, like, yeah, sure, whatever you guys want, I'll do, because he has no skin in the game. Like, he has nothing to really drive him to really need to do anything. Which I think, within Winter Soldier, he's kind of driven into a wall. But his driving force eventually gets very interesting in Winter Soldier. But anyways, because we have to kind of like we kind of have to put like something in front of Captain to get him to want to keep going, uh because otherwise, like, he's like, what does he have to freaking do? So ultimately, Captain America's like, well, do you really want me to like wear the red, white, and blue again? Like, come on, like, that was kind of like goofy in past. That was me in my dancing monkey days. Like, do you really want that kind of do you still really kind of want that kind of flair right now? And Coulson is like, yeah, we desperately need it more so now than ever. So we now go into uh, Hulk's story, where Hulk is again taking care of some third world problems. Black Widow is coming in because ultimately Nick Fury told her to seek out Hulk. So ultimately, she's talking to him, kind of really figuring out where his head's at, and Hulk is really just like, dude, don't like, kind of really just don't try to like think that you can persuade me. It's like, dude, if anything, like I can just see a threat coming from a mile away, and ultimately, if you want to mess with me, like try and just shoot me in the head, and ultimately the other guy is gonna be spitting out the bullet. And ultimately, like, Bruce is really just kind of testing like Black Widow a lot through him talking. It seems like when he's talking to Black Widow, it seems like in his head he's doing some chess movements to ultimately see um like again how she'll react. And when when interestingly seeing Black Widow kind of talking to Bruce, kind of mentioning, okay, here's why Bruce has been um, kind of hidden away for so long, because they have been protecting him, knowing full well that eventually they're going to need to call upon him one day, and here is that time. And so eventually we get, of course, for Hulk to just go, okay, sure, like like I have nothing better to do, I guess. Like ultimately, um considering Shield has found me, I guess there's nowhere to run anymore. So he eventually joins the Avengers team. Thor reasonably is very easily swayed because uh, basically you throw Loki into any mix and might as well just say, Thor's there. Yeah, you better believe it. So we go into this movie, and so Loki has the Tesseract, and it seems that his next goal is to figure out what their next move is. He's talking to Selvig, he's talking to Clint. Ultimately, the next journey is to get an eyeball and for Loki to make a huge distraction, because ultimately they need um, some chemicals to stabilize the Tesseract. So ultimately, Loki is going out in public and just kind of dancing around. It's like, yeah, like, ooh, yeah, like, I'm here. Like, ultimately, he goes into this gallery and, like, pokes out somebody's eyeball. And then after that, he just goes out in the front of the building to be a distraction to ultimately see who's going to come out to challenge him, because he has to prove as a distraction for Clint Barton to do what he needs to do. So ultimately, uh, Loki is of course outside of the building, telling everybody to kneel, and ultimately telling like the human race how again um, they are an ant to his boot, and basically isn't them all bowing down to him their natural order of things. And so ultimately one person stands up and he mentions that, well, like, I won't bow to men like you. And Loki of course hits him with, well, there are no men like me. And Q, Loki ending up attacking this old man because he stood up to him, and that's when we get the soldier. And so Captain America has to re-reference to us that basically he had fought a man in Germany, and ultimately um, he didn't like how there's some guys that like to be bullies. And so ultimately Loki has to like mention that, yeah, Captain America, man out of time, and this and that, and we have to kind of um ultimately just start to like long-windedly have these like little like origin things, like pressing to let us know who, not only um to remind us who Captain America is, because again, we, I guess, for people that had never seen the Avengers movie. So it gets to the point to where Captain eventually just throws a punch to Loki, and they start fighting it out where everybody is running and scrambling. Um, so eventually it gets down to the point to where um, Loki and Captain are fighting it out, and it gets to the point to where we all of a sudden are having Hawkeye, or we're ultimately having Black Widow fly in with some jet, and all the while we're eventually hearing her radio station go off in some with some bizarre-ish music, So we have to where uh, Tony is telling Romanoff that he's on his way, and of course, blaringly, we have ACDC music, because ultimately that is Iron Man's theme song. For any number of times he has to come in queued up to ACDC. So ultimately, we have we have Tony um, with Loki knocked down, basically just shows every single one of his weaponry, and then mentions, okay, reindeer games, like freaking like it's time to call it quits. Where's the Tesseract? And so ultimately now Loki is obtained by the Avengers on this jets, flying away back to the helicarrier. We ultimately, of course, now have to deal with Thor. Because Thor, again, wants to just get his man, or ultimately kind of convince Loki that he needs to come home. So, reasonably, while they're flying through their jets, all of a sudden they hear some thunder, and Loki's starting to shake in his boots, barely, because ultimately he knows what that sound is. And all the other Avengers are just like, well, hey, like, what's got you all bothered? Loki's like, well, I don't normally like the sounds that happen after thunder. And so ultimately, we find that Thor is onto the jet, grabs Loki and takes him, and Captain America's like, "Whoa, another Asgardian!" And then Iron Man just grabs his helmet and goes quickly off to battle. And Captain America's like, "Whoa, like, hey, like, we need to come up with a plan of attack." Of course, uh, Iron Man goes off half cocked with his thing. Well, yeah, I have a plan. Attack. And freaking goes off. So, ultimately, Captain ultimately just grabs a parachute and parachutes off the jet to figure out what's all going on. Funny enough, in Winter Soldier, he doesn't need a parachute, but in this movie, he does. So, going into this, Loki and Thor are talking it out. They're like, "Brother, I thought you had died. It's like me and father mourned for you." And Loki's like, "You mourned?" And so ultimately, like, Thor is trying to reason with Loki, but ultimately he realizes that his mind is a he's a bag of cats. Like there's no reasoning with this guy, and because Banner says it afterwards. So ultimately, we have Thor trying to reason with him, and then Thor is ultimately met with being smashed through by Iron Man right before he's like, I want you to listen to me, Loki, and then immediately get hit with Iron Man, and Loki's like, I'm listening. So we ultimately have this fight out with Iron Man and Thor, which is really great. I love this, this kind of this like uh, kind of tech versus old fashioned muscle. And ultimately, it's funny that eventually, when Thor um, puts this attack to Iron Man, how basically, like Iron Man consumes the thunderous attack, and he like his battery is like way overly charged, like 200%, and he's like, "Oh wow, that's great." It's like he's like, "Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?" and so like Iron Man is basically telling him, it's like, "Hey, like you're in the way of Loki. Like Loki has the Tesseract. Like I don't care about you. I just care about getting this guy to get me the Tesseract. That's all that matters." So they battle it out, and eventually Captain America gets into the mix, and ultimately Captain tells him to put the hammer down. It's like wait a minute, we have to talk about this. Let's talk this out. And Iron Man's like, no, don't tell him to put the hammer down. And freaking that's when they do the big huge effect of Iron Man hitting Captain America's shield and makes this big huge like blast. And so basically they realize that it's like, hey, like how about we put our differences aside to go after the real true like legitimate threat of this whole thing. And so eventually they take Loki to ultimately put him into this cage cell. They lock him up because he's a threat to society. And so ultimately they lock him up, and so now Thor again is trying to understand Loki how he is now, and everybody else is trying to analyze Loki and basically try to figure out what his plan is. And all the while, Loki is talking to Fury and kind of mentioning some, again, some very Shakespearean cryptic like sense that Banner is trying to decipher. So ultimately, funny enough, Iron Man talks to Thor, and he's like, hey, don't take it personally, Thor. It's like, or don't take it personally, Point Break. It's like you have a mean swing. Like, freaking talks about a guy that's playing Gallagher in the background, and he's ultimately throwing some bugs onto some of Fury's gear, and then he walks away. While also talking about how does Nick Fury see all the screens that he has, and Marie Hill says that he turns. It's like, sounds exhausting. So ultimately, everyone's trying to decipher who Loki is, and basically everybody is trying to tear him down, and Thor is kind of bizarrely coming to his aid, coming to Loki's aid. He's like, well, hey, he might be a villain to you, but like he's an Asgardian. He's my brother. And then like Widow hits him with like, well, he's killed like 50 people in like 2 days, and he's like, well, he's adopted. It's like so. you have it to where like everyone's trying to decipher that this guy is a crazy man of with a with a head of a bag of cats and this and that, and Thor is mentioning that uh, Loki's brain is far afield. It's not just power that he craves. It's something more. And so and um, ultimately Thor realizing that they as guardians come in here, and when they want something they'll stubbornly like not let go, and they'll just battle to the very ends, like Billsheim. And so, anyways, like Thor, like would realizing that Thor was like him at some point, but he realizes that he chosen a better path. So Thor or Loki is talking about a light for all mankind to share, and ultimately talking about several other Shakespearean esh-like things, which eventually Captain America is trying to go to Iron Man and Banner, or Tony and Banner, and try to like figure out what Loki was trying to say, because ultimately something's bugging him. And like everybody's talking about like Loki's flying monkeys and all this other stuff, and Cap got that reference. So again, like um Captain is trying to figure out what's going on, and so ultimately he goes on his own mission to find out that Shield has had Hydra weapons, like trying to figure out how to weaponize the Tesseract. And also we find out that Tony uh, has bugged the um, Fury's gear, and ultimately he's going to encrypt it and figure it all out. And so ultimately, here's where Captain America is like, "Hey, you shouldn't have done that, because like that is like Fury's on our side and this and that." Where it's really starting to twist and turn to where we're like starting to see people like start to really bicker against one another, to just be like, God, you people are just like why can't you just let kind of certain things just lie? Why do you want to know everything? That's the problem with everybody, is people want to know everything, and maybe there's certain things that you shouldn't know, um, for your own good. So we we go into that Widow is eventually going to talk to Loki and again figure out that his head is still a bag of cats. And so ultimately she's just like, well, hey, my master plan is I, one, need to figure out how to get Hawkeye back onto my side. And then ultimately I need to figure out like how to get Hawkeye, but then I also need to figure out like what his next plan is. So ultimately, Black Widow is seductively going to Loki, saying, hey, Loki, how's it going?" And immediately, because we figured out that Banner has like cryptidly deciphered what Loki had been talking about. So now she figures that, okay, like this guy is cryptically telling us what we need to know, and I'm the perfect person for this. So we find out that ultimately Loki's master plan was to try and otherwise persuade the Hulk and make him a villain, which ultimately that's the way this freaking movie should have went, but it didn't. And because ultimately uh, Widow is talking to Loki about Hawkeye and like, well, how's Clint? Kind of like, hey, I want to know about my friend, but also I want to know about other things. And so ultimately, Loki tells her that, like, hey, I know everything about everyone now. Like, I know especially about you, and like, and how you're talking about your red on your ledger. It's like there's gushing red, like, just gushing of red. And he talks about South Paulo or I'm going to butcher that name, and all these other kind of excursions that she's had, like gushing red. And so ultimately now, um, Black Widow is throwing at Loki that he's a monster, and Loki's like, no, you have the monster here in your ship. And she's like, aha, that's your game plan. You want to unleash the Hulk onto the ship. And so immediately we have the rest of the Avengers all bickering it out because they have nothing better to do with their time, just to bicker. So we have Captain that is ultimately bickering to Iron Man because they're having this exchange because ultimately they don't like Captain America didn't like that he was trying to steal Fury's information, and like Cap and Iron and Tony didn't like that. It's just like, well, like I don't like that everything made out of you was made from a bottle, and plus on top of that, it's like he doesn't like that he's like the PC police where he's trying to be the guy that wants to um just be like the moral, or not the PC police, the morality police, and that he has to blow the whistle on everybody that's not quite doing the right thing. And so ultimately, we have this exchange, of course, with with everybody telling us like, okay, hey, why do we have to put this team together? And Fury's mentioning it's like, well, we're at a higher form of war, and ultimately, when Thor came here, like that started to escalate things, and now we're getting these threats more higher than we ever thought that there would be. And so ultimately we have these bickering back and forth, these great exchanges. Of course, we have to everything special came out of you came from a bottle, and then well, whatever uh, whatever is good about you, and it's like, well, I'm a genius playboy philanthropist, and all this great exchange going on, which is ultimately again just a building up of like, hey, if you guys never saw Iron Man, this is who Iron Man is. And again, for anybody who didn't know Captain America, this is who Captain America is. And so bizarrely, Thor is randomly saying it's like, yes, you guys are so petty, and this and that, and like everybody's going in this room just start bickering and all this stuff. So eventually Hulk is just like, you know what? Like, I don't understand. Like, it seems like this staff is bizarrely trying to mass manipulate people, because that's just what it does. And so Hulk is just like, you know what? I don't get um, why Captain America is on threat watch, and I like, and you know what? I'm just kind of getting tired of a lot of this. So ultimately, I'm going to show you my magic trick. You want to know how I stay so calm? Because ultimately, freaking Tony had jabbed him with some kind of electrical device, and he didn't flinch. He's like, "Why aren't you angry?" He's like, "I love how you become this big, huge, raging green monster, and like, I want to see some of that." I want to get some of that. Can I see some of that? So ultimately, Black Widow is rushing to find Hulk, and he's like, "You need to get out of here as quickly as possible because uh, Loki's plays to trigger you, to make you upset." And so ultimately, we have it to where now we have Loki's men are trying to uh, get into the helicarrier because ultimately they want to take advantage of getting not only getting Loki back, but to take advantage of of this moment. So ultimately, they are scrambling into the helicarrier, popping everything off. Hawkeye is kind of taking down everything, and so while everybody's in a ruckus and everything like that, we ultimately accidentally, while in rubble of certain things, we have to where Black Widow and Hulk, or Black Widow and Bruce, are kind of just left to their own devices. And Bruce all of a sudden is changing into the Hulk right as Black Widow is like, oh crap. So ultimately, Black Widow is like, hey, calm down. It's like, if anything, like everyone will be safe. I'll put my life against it. And then Hulk's like, your life, as he's freaking changing from being the Hulk. And then as soon as the Hulk is changing, like Black Widow's like, I need to get the F out of here. So she is running. The Hulk is coming after her. She's trying to as quickly as possible get away from him. To where ultimately Thor is noticing that Hulk is Hulk. And so eventually all havoc is breaking loose and freaking Thor is trying to take down the Hulk. And this battle is amazing. I love this battle. Like, to have Thor fighting this CGI like character, I'm like, man, this is awesome. And like, this is the best part of the movie when you have Thor fighting Hulk, and it's like these exchange of blows. He's like smacking his hammer on him, and it's a freaking awesome. And all the while, eventually, the helicarrier is going down. One of the wings has been popped off, let's just say, of the helicarrier. And so Captain and Iron Man have to work together and put on the suit and, and let's go a few rounds. And ultimately, they have to work together to ultimately get one of the fans of the helicarrier to work again. So ultimately, Cap is trying to protect this lever, and while Iron Man is going into um, trying to get this fan to working again, like get some of the pieces and this and that to get it working. So all the while, we have it to where eventually Widow is fighting Hawkeye, and she eventually just bangs the crap out of this guy's head to get him to stop fighting. And so that's great. So all the while, we eventually just have it to where we, excuse me, we now have it to where Iron Man is stuck into the turner, stuck into the fan of the helicarrier, and he's like, "Oh crap!" And then all of a sudden, he just starts. He's stuck in this fan, waiting for Cap to turn the lever. Lever. He's like, "Yeah, just give me a second. It's a little harder than it looks." So Cap pulls the red lever, and then Iron Man gets free. Eventually, it seems like someone was going to shoot at Cap. Iron Man quickly saves the day. So basically, it gets down to the point to where Loki gets free from his boot, let's just say, his cage. And because ultimately Thor realizes that he was getting free, and so ultimately he tries he tries to get Loki, but ends up in the cage instead, to where Loki ends up dropping the cage and Thor falls. And so ultimately, Coulson goes in and tries to get Loki um, to give up, because ultimately he comes because ultimately Coulson comes up with a weapon that he doesn't know what it does. But the weapon is basically just like the destroyer and um, shoots at Loki. He's like, oh, that's what it does. But the sad thing of it is, Loki stabs Coulson and kills him, or what we're led to believe kills him. And so while Thor is falling away in this cage, he ultimately um, realizes that there's a crack in the cage, because the cage is made out of mostly glass, which is stupid. But so Thor ends up breaking through the cage before the cage ends up crashing onto the ground, because ultimately he had Mjolnir in hand. So he gets out of the cage, flies out of the cage, and then eventually just they end up having to kind of collect their blessings and just kind of like, okay, we got the the spinners working again, like we're on top. But the only problem is they lose Loki along the way. And so ultimately Hawkeye is back in town, and he's just like, yeah, like I hope that I can just put an arrow to Loki's eye socket and I'll feel better about things again. So basically, Black Widow and Hawkeye are having this sweet moment about like him coming back from being normal again, and kind of mentioning about all the things that they do, and that they really need to go after Loki again, because again, Widow with her red in her ledger, and ultimately talking to Loki made her think, yeah, we really need to take this guy down, because like this is gods and monsters and stuff that we don't really quite understand, but now is the time to like come up in arms and fight this thing. So cue us having Captain America telling everybody to suit up, because like, hey, like we're on the ball now, Loki's out, and eventually his master plan is going to be uh, to take down or do something with the Stark Tower. Like that's his master plan. So we have Selvig on at the Stark Tower. He's controlling the Tesseract. The Tesseract is opening this worm portal to ultimately getting all the T'Challa to T'Chari to I had it eventually. T'Chari, T'Chari, down to the ground, down forces, down good times, and so ultimately Loki is flying around because he's like, yeah, I won, I escaped, good for me, and so ultimately again, Captain America is telling everybody to suit up, and so everybody is ultimately all back, and so we found out that ultimately Hulk had fallen from the ship, because ultimately he had kind of been crazily going through the ship and destroying everything, and so they had to have a fighter jet to try and uh, distract him. To ultimately Hulk grabs the jet, and ultimately the jet ejects, and so Hulk eventually just lands on the ground, and he was full on nude on the ground, his butt nude on the ground. It's like, so we have some guy that's telling Bruce Banner, it's like, son, I think you have a problem. Like, so we ultimately have it to where Banner is trying to come and find his way back uh, to where all the other Avengers are. So all the Avengers decide to otherwise set up shop and to ultimately get to one location because they're starting to realize all these these I'm gonna call them army guys for the rest of this thing. The army guys, the Loki's army is going all crazy and going all loose on the city, and so uh, really, we have the Avengers technically assembling at this one point in Manhattan because ultimately this entire army is getting loose and they are wreaking havoc, and so ultimately Avengers are the only ones left to stop them. And so reasonably, they're like, well, hey, like we have everybody but Banner, so this sucks. But then eventually Banner comes in with his weird looking motorcycle and he's like, well, hey, now we have Banner. Like, this is great. And so Iron Man is ultimately starting to take down some of these armed forces, and ultimately everybody is starting to get their licks in. We have it to where uh, to where we have it to where where now Hulk is or Bruce is coming to the evade and like, hey, like I'm here. So Cap is like, okay, you got to suit up. So reasonably, Cap is for finally one sake of this moment being a leader and telling people, okay, all they have to do. Um, Ultimately, telling Iron Man to just kind of get some stragglers and to have and to take Clint to kind of pop off some of the guys on top there with his arrows, and so Iron Man and Clint like grab one another and eventually pop off, and so we have to where Cap is telling Thor like, okay, hey, like you got the thunder, bring it. It's like bottleneck that whole hole up there, that black hole up there, or the dimensional hole up there. Bottle that thing up. So there goes Thor. Ultimately, Cap and Widow are just going to be together, just kind of on the ground, just kind of taking down whatever's left of people calling things out to one another, and then ultimately, Thor or ultimately Hulk not only is going to be the one to smash this big T'Chari giant big monster esh like thing, because ultimately Tony was bringing the party to them with this big huge whale monster, and so ultimately Black Widow's like, I don't think that's a party, like that's a weird party. So ultimately Hulk bashes this big monster esh like thing, and then eventually his goal is to like Hulk smash. It's like Cap tells Banner to Hulk smash. It's like just take everything down, take everything that you find, take them all down, do it now. So ultimately, everybody is kind of doing their goals. Everybody's just kind of like just chatting at one another, letting them know, like, hey, yeah, like this still sucks that we're fighting all these people. Like, yeah, it does suck, but you know what? Like, I found about this about these kind of creatures. Like, if anything, like Iron Man's talking to Hawkeye, and Hawkeye's telling him, it's like, well, hey, uh, hey, Tony, what are you doing? And he's like, you know what, I'm just trying to find some stragglers, just trying to, just keeping them off the streets. And so ultimately, Hawkeye tells Tony that it's like, well, hey, they can't bank worth a damn. So if anything, you can kind of just maneuver your way to like outbeat them. He's like, oh, good tip. And so ultimately, he takes that advice and just takes him down. So Hawkeye is consistently throwing arrows out to any of these guys up in the skies. So we eventually get to a point to where eventually everybody is eventually going to center on Stark Tower. That's their journey to get to there, to that big ugly skyscraper. So reasonably, we have it to where Black Widow is eventually fighting with Cap, but then eventually she jumps on one of the Chitauri that has a kind of mobile, or kind of has um, a flying thing, because if anything, their jet was shot down. So if anything, she goes and flies all the way up to Stark Tower, and it gets to a point where eventually Loki makes it there to the tower, and then so does Thor, because Thor is like, aha. So Loki and Thor try to fight this out, and ultimately, again, Thor is still trying to reason with Loki, and talking about like that he had created all this madness, and then he's still trying to persuade him because he's his brother and this and that. But ultimately, Loki stabs Thor, and he realizes that there is still no reason with no way to reason uh, to be able to reason with his brother at this point. So ultimately, eventually, we have it to where uh, Iron Man, or Tony, eventually has to recharge his suit. Here's where we get to eventually having to have qualms and quips with. Here's where we get to the big story. So Loki and Iron Man. Iron Man has to change his suit, so Loki is just kind of like, hey, you're here. Hey, let's talk. So ultimately, Tony is mentioning, it's like, well, hey, hey, isn't it great you're here, and kind of things like that. And so ultimately, Loki's like, well, hey, why don't you have your armor on, like, fight me and this and that. And he's like, well, yeah, that'd be great, but you know what, my suit's seen some kind of mileage, and you got the glow stick of destiny, so it's like, man, how would I just kind of wait on that? So ultimately, they're talking, they're doing their exchanges. Of course, we get to the um I have an army. Tony says we have a Hulk. There's no way that you're gonna win. Like, if anything, if you even if you win, like if we lose, you're gonna make damn sure that we're gonna avenge that loss. So ultimately, Iron Man is looking for the next Mark suit. He's just kind of like drinking and ultimately kind of talking to Loki, doing some exchanges. Ultimately, basically threatening him. So eventually Loki is just tired of this exchange, so he grabs Tony and throws him out the building. And all the while, Tony's like, "Deploy, deploy!" It's like when, like get my suit ready, like stop with the whole spinning wheels. And so ultimately, suit shoots out and grabs Tony right before uh, he ends up uh, falling, and so eventually we get to a point where Hulk uh, eventually grabs Loki at some point and bashes him around and calls him puny god, which I thought was hilarious. So all of this mad scrambling going on, we have eventually at some point Hulk and or Captain and Thor fighting, and like Thor's kind of getting tired. Uh, he's like, "Are you ready for another bout?" And Captain's like, "Getting a little sleepy." It's like, come on, like even though I'm getting freaking exhausted, like come on, let's go. Because ultimately, we have uh, at some point Thor and Loki like fighting together and fighting this one big like whalish like T'Chari thing. T'Chari, T'Churi. I'm gonna mispronounce that. So, anyways, ultimately we are pushed into again. Um, like it gets to the point where Black Widow can figure out how to bottleneck this whole portal thing. The only problem is Iron Man found out that the shield is going to just launch some rocket to take down this city because they hope that nuking this will take down the weapon that's opening up this portal. Well, Iron Man seeks out this weapon and shoots it out to space, shoots it out to the D'Chari to take down all of their defenses, and then Black Widow is going to bottleneck that portal and take it down. But Iron Man has to eventually sleek back into Earth's orbit. But eventually, we find out that um, that Iron Man like lost all air and stuff like that because eventually like his power stopped working. So he's falling, and Thor is noticing this, and uh, he's noticing that he's falling, and so he's gonna go to fly up to get him, and so we have to where like Thor or Hulk grabs him and kind of stops him from falling, and then like takes off. Hulk rips off Iron Man's mask, and eventually just shouts at him uh, to wake him up. Eventually, he asks, "Did anybody kiss me?" like, so um, so Captain America's like, "Hey, we won." He's like, and Iron Man's like, "Oh, great, yeah, great." It's like, "Hey guys, I wanna try this shawarma joint. Like, free on me." Like, yeah, because it's like, if anything, like they have to bring up this like whole shawarma thing like for I don't know how freaking long. Because it's like, yeah, I have a shawarma joint. It's like, yeah, let's try that thing out. So reasonably, we have it to where like Loki is kind of like waking up is like, and then ultimately he wakes up to me met by the entire Avengers team, and Troll to me is like, you know what, I'll have that drink now, and like that's pretty much how the movie ends. So an hour and a half holy crap about talking about this movie, but at the end of the day, I think it's well worth it. I don't know, maybe people will like hearing about the Avengers movie all over again, and like there's a lot of good exchanges. Like there's a lot of good things about this movie, but when looking at it as a whole, I'm like, man, I wish this movie was like more. I wish that there was a little bit more about this movie because ultimately having Loki as the villain kind of just and like that's what I thought from like when it was in theaters. Once I heard Loki was the villain, I was like, yeah, but isn't there much more something exciting going on? And like the whole exciting thing going on is to ultimately kind of see Thanos and kind of just to see that he's ultimately the guy, the puppet holding all the strings, and basically that Loki needed to win this because there was no crew, no moon, no burn crevice for him to hide on if he were to have lost. And so he did. So eventually it took him a very long time, but eventually he's gonna eventually at some point get his comeuppance. Or so we think. So going into my last thoughts about this movie. So there's some good things, there's some funny things about this movie, but when looking back on it, like I was like looking back on it now, it was great for the time that it came out, but when having to look back on it, like there's some good things about this movie, but there's also some stuff that it kind of still nags at me. Like the whole thing about when Tony Stark kind of tapped into Nick Fury's gear, how basically we realized that, wait a minute, here's the problem. So Tony didn't uncover that, spoiler alert for other movies, for Winter Soldier, we found out we found out that Shield is with Hydra, Hydra is with Shield. It's one and the same, and Tony did not figure that out earlier. Did the movies never correct this? Did the movies never mention this? So Tony ended up hacking through this information, but he didn't find anything on Hydra being in Shield, and that is the one thing that has bugged me ever since. That everyone said after watching this movie back, and saying, "Hey, yeah, like Tony never figured out that Hydra was in Shield. What the fudge? What the f, Tony? Little lazy on that, brother. Little lazy." So ultimately, like an interesting what if thing would be probably to correct the timeline of what would happen if Tony would have figured out by Fury's intel that Hydra was Shield. And I think that that would have maybe been a very much more interesting episode to do for a what if series. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here because ultimately I really want to start watching Agent Carter. So ultimately, probably see that review coming soon of me finally cementingly watching that show. And ultimately, I'm also going to be maybe if people enjoy this review, going into other Marvel films. Ultimately, again, I don't want to just do like the easy ones, the Captain Americas, the this and that. I want to kind of go into every kinds of Marvel movies again. Kind of interested in rewatching the Blade movie over again and the Ghost Rider film, and kind of remembering the Ghost Rider films. Ugh, Ghost Rider films are really rough, but I do love Nicolas Cage. But again, those movies are rough because it's just like, man, the movie wasn't quite that good enough when looking back on it now. But maybe a Ghost Rider TV series will correct that, or a movie series or franchise will correct and make those movies better in my mind. So, yeah, I really want to go back into some odd kind of Marvel movies, and at the end of the day, here's where I say goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.